All right, so now we're going to get into thinking about pollination syndromes and how they affect flowering plant evolution in terms of floral structure and other floral characteristics. And it's important first to note, as I mentioned, that all flowering plants ancestrally appear to have been animal pollinated, which we can infer from phylogenies as we understand them now based on molecular data from DNA sequences. It looks like the earliest branching lineages of flowering plants were animal pollinated. And the majority of flowering plants today are animal pollinated, and the majority of the animal pollinated plants are insect pollinated. And of the insect pollinators, bees are the most important pollinators in general. And bees are great pollinators. They are relatively quick learners for insects. They have good memory, ability to learn. They learn how to operate complex flowers that have complex patterning. Bilaterally symmetric flowers are commonly visited by bees. And the plants that have co-evolved with bees oftentimes can produce relatively small amounts of pollen, although pollen is also collected as a reward by female bees. So some of the pollen is lost to female bee collection, and you can see pollen here on the hind leg of a bee, female bee, honeybee here. But they also produce nectar. So there's a nectar reward for both male and female bees as well. And bees see in the same visual spectrum that we do, but it's offset a little bit towards shorter wavelength light. So as you can see here, here's a daisy head under normal conditions as we would see it, and here it is under UV light. And you can see this bullseye patterning that we can't see, but a bee can see. It sees into the UV, into the spectrum, but its visual spectrum is shifted, so it can't see red light. It can't see the long wavelength lights that we can see. Red just looks black to them. So bee pollinated flowers tend to be blue to yellow, but not red typically. Bees have some olfactory sense, and the flower scents there's commonly an attractive odor to the flowers that we perceive as attractive as well, but not super strong typically, although it can be quite strong. And yeah, so that's those, and they often have a landing platform. Bees have to land to pollinate, and so there has to be some kind of a landing platform to allow the bee to be able to sit while it feeds. And before I go any further, I just want to point out that these types of syndromes I'm talking about represent suites of characteristics associated with a particular pollinator or a guild of pollinators that does not necessarily represent all of the effective pollinators of those plants. So what's been found with pollination syndromes, this matching between pollinator and flower generally represents a match with the most effective pollinator, the most important pollinator, but there could be all kinds of other pollinators that are effective, but just not as effective. And so in general, floral evolution tends to follow with the most effective pollinators. And in the case of moth pollination, unlike bees, these are hover feeders, like hawk moths. And they also, they don't collect pollen. They strictly are after nectar, but they inadvertently have pollen deposited on them in the course of probing for nectar. Flowers that are moth pollinated often have a nectar tube that can be quite long and narrow and delicate. The probing by a moth tongue is quite gentle, so it's not likely to damage the tube. But these do produce nectar. They often have white coloration or whitish coloration. They need to be visible under low light conditions. These moths are often most active in at dusk or low light conditions. And the flowers of moth plants are are famous for producing really wonderful, heavy, sweet scents like jasmine that can carry long distances so the moths can follow those scent trails. And there's no landing platform. Moths are hover feeders, so they don't need to land. Butterflies are also important lepidopteran pollinators. And of course, they're operating under brighter light conditions. The flower colors tend to be brightly colorful and quite a wide array of colors. And commonly, they have to land to feed like bees. So there needs to be some kind of landing platform. And in this case, an individual flower is flat. Here we can see a whole inflorescence is a corium, allowing the butterfly to negotiate this whole inflorescence, walking around here. And butterflies, they don't have quite the sense of smell of or olfaction as moths, but they also have olfactory sense. It's pretty well developed, and the flower scents tend to be detectable to us and quite sweet. Again, these guys are just after nectar. So there sometimes are nectar tubes, and nectar is produced by these flowers. Interestingly, butterflies are not the most intelligent pollinators, at least in terms of their ability to learn. I've talked to someone who was involved in butterfly cognition studies, and he told me that butterflies can learn, but everything that they learn displaces what they learned previously. So they can only learn one thing at a time, and they lose what they learned previously by doing that. So, and if you startle them or they get scared, they forget what they learned. So they have limited learning ability. But of course, birds are incredibly intelligent by vertebrates, and in the New World, North, South America, Central America, hummingbirds are bird pollinators, which are also hover flyers. If you go to the Old World, hummingbirds are not native there, and the birds there, like the sunbirds, need to land, and there are platforms for them to do so in inflorescences of hummingbird pollinated plants. But in New World bird pollinated plants, there is no landing platform, and birds are after nectar, and they need a lot of it. So these flowers produce a lot of nectar. They often have a very durable floral tube to withstand the pretty aggressive probing by a bird beak, which could potentially damage the tube. And they are commonly red. Birds, unlike bees, can see in the red end of the spectrum well, and that is a common specialization of bird pollinated flowers to be red or reddish. But birds, pollinating birds at least, have a really poor sense of smell. And so the floral scents are generally not detectable floral scents associated with bird pollinated flowers, at least from our noses. They appear to be pretty scentless commonly. All right, so that's it for biotic pollination, but wind pollination is another important feature in many angiosperms. I think it's around 20% of all angiosperm species are wind pollinated. And this has evolved secondarily in flowering plants. So I mentioned animal pollination appears to be ancestral in flowering plants, but wind pollination syndrome has arisen multiple times, and more times than we used to think. Wherever it's evolved, it's resulted in a really remarkably similar suite of morphological features of the inflorescences that are incredibly convergent on one another, such that earlier taxonomists, prior to the availability of DNA data to understand relationships, sometimes lumped these families into common orders and other higher level groupings, thinking that they represented a single lineage. But in fact, we know now that there have been more evolutionary events that have led to the evolution of wind pollination. And it just tends to lead to this cascade of evolutionary changes that are very similar. And it makes a lot of sense. Let's go through it briefly. And this tends to evolve in groups of plants that occur in dense stands, not necessarily monocultures, but dense stands like grasses, hardwood trees, and temperate forests. And what we tend to see is this evolution of imperfect flowers. Flowers are unisexual, either pistillate or staminate, but not both. And the staminate flowers produce a large amount of pollen, typically. I mean, this is not the most precise pollination system. It's a bit hit and miss, even though there are studies that have shown that eddy currents can exist around the female flowers that can help to bring the pollen in, that sort of thing. But compared to animal pollination, it's relatively inefficient. Petals would just get in the way of pollen movement, and there's no reason to have them to attract pollinators because the pollination vector is wind. It's not an animal. And so the petals tend to be really reduced or absent, and they're not showy. And often the flowering happens before the leaves expand. In the case of deciduous plants that are wind pollinated, they tend to flower before the leaves come out in the spring. The leaves would just get in the way of pollen movement. And the anthers of the stamens open in dry weather, and the pollen itself is dry with a smooth surface. And here you can see a pollen grain of a wind pollinated plant. In contrast, the pollen of animal pollinated plants is oily, and it has a sculptured surface, and those features help to allow the pollen to clump together and to adhere to an animal body. So in this case, though, the pollen needs to disperse, the grains need to disperse from one another and carry through the air as easily as possible. So in addition to opening in dry weather, having dry pollen with a smooth surface, there's also enlarged stigmatic surfaces often on the pistils, as you can see here, which expand the surface area for capturing pollen grains, which can help. So there also are no rewards. There's no nectar production. If there is any nectar produced, it would be an extra floral nectaries away from the flowers that might be associated, for example, with protection of the plant against herbivores by feeding ants or something that might attack herbivores, but it's not associated with pollination. Okay, so now I want to turn to fruits. And how are we doing for time? Okay, so fruits also are incredibly diverse like flowers in their morphology, the way they operate. But the main function of a fruit is to disperse the seeds. And like the flowers, fruits are a unique feature of flowering plants. No other group of plants has fruits. The term fruit is sometimes used loosely with other botanical organisms, but a true fruit represents a ripened ovary. Ovaries and pistils only occur in flowering plants. And this diversity of fruits that we see in flowering plants across species represents, again, like in the case of flower diversity, coevolution with dispersers. In this case, not dispersers of pollen, as in the case of flowers, but in this case, dispersers of seeds. So we see this evidence of a lot of diversity and specialization associated with dispersal of seeds. It's really important for plants, which need to get their seeds away from the parent plant. Oftentimes, being rooted in place, you can potentially compete with your offspring. So there's some real benefits to moving your seeds away from you. But there's a sweet spot there in terms of dispersal distance. You don't want to get outside the habitats necessarily that you're suited for. In any case, we can just talk about fruits ecologically and morphologically rather than phylogenetically in terms of dry fruits and fleshy fruits. So dry fruits are fruits that are either dispersed or are either dehiscent, which means that they open up at maturity to release the seeds into the environment, or they're indehiscent, which means that they don't release the seeds and the fruit itself is a dispersal mechanism, or can be. So the fruit is dispersed. So in the case of dehiscent fruits, there are a couple of general types. So the simplest type is a follicle, which opens along one suture or line of dehiscence. Milkweed is a great example of this, to release its seeds. And follicles represent a single carpel. So this is a pistil of one carpel, and it's opening along the ventral suture here, where we think in evolutionary times, the two margins of the leaves were fused, and that releases the seeds, that line along that line of dehiscence. And here we have a capsule, which is a dehiscent dry fruit that is made up of multiple carpels. There might be multiple chambers in this ovary as well, and there's multiple lines of dehiscence. It opens along multiple sutures to release the seeds. And if it opens right in the middle of a locular chamber, we'd call it a loculicidal capsule. If it opens right along a septum or one of the partitions between the chambers, it would be called a septicidal capsule. That's a little more detail than we need to go into now. A legume is a term for it's similar to a follicle. It represents a single carpel, but it opens along two lines of dehiscence on the ventral suture and one on the opposite side as well. But this term is associated only with members of the pea family, the Fabaceae. And you'll see that a lot. These terms for fruits are often associated with a particular family. So there is some terminology that is very taxonomic. Indehiscent fruits include achenes, which are dry indehiscent one-seeded fruits, where the seed is not fused to the inside of the ovary. The free is loose inside. And here you can see an example with a dandelion fruit. Although technically this is from an inferior ovary, it would be called a cypsela, but we're not going to worry about that. It has, in this case, there's a beak of this is actually fruit wall, and then the sepals up here are modified into a parachute-like structure, and this whole thing is a dispersal unit. Here we see the fruit of a maple, which we call a samara. Because of the wings, the fruit wall itself is modified into a wing, and this one, it's dropped from the tree. It has a helicopter-like, helicopter propeller-like movement that can move it away from the parent plant. A grain is a type of fruit that where the pericarp or the fruit wall is fused to the seed coat and represents a unit of dispersal. And a grain is another case like a legume where it's associated with one family of plant, namely the grass family. So there are pseudograins like amaranth that are actually eudicots, but grasses are the family that produce grains. And then a nut is very similar to an achene, except you just have a thicker ovary wall here associated with the seed. And the seed may or may not be fused inside. Fleshy fruits, there are a couple of major types. And I should point out that dispersal of indehiscent fruits is often associated with either abiotic means, like wind or water, or it could be associated with animal dispersal by, for example, adherence of the fruit to the outside of an animal. Whereas fleshy fruits are the result, have evolved a mechanism of seed dispersal through the gut of an animal. So this is internal dispersal using animals, where the animal eats the fruit, which is of course nutritious and delicious, and it passes through the gut. The seeds pass through the gut unharmed. And in many cases, the gastric juices are necessary to stimulate the seeds to germinate, and they end up being deposited in the environment with their own pile of fertilizer. So it's a commonly, there are many cases of the evolution of fleshy fruits, of course. Berries are basically just fruits that have all the walls of the fruit are fleshy, including the innermost wall of the fruit. And so a tomato is technically a berry, as are many other fruits like an orange, and of course, things like some of the berries we typically think of as berries. But also, there's another type of fleshy fruit called a drupe, where the innermost layer of the fruit wall, namely the endocarp, is bony and surrounds the seed. So a stone fruit like a cherry or a plum or apricot is an example of a stone fruit. Or an almond, basically an unshelled almond where the husk has been removed, that bony husk that has to be removed to get to the seed is the endocarp. So a drupe is fleshy except for the endocarp, the innermost layer. And this term pepo is a special name for the berry of a member of the Cucurbitaceae, the cucumber family. Hesperidium is the specialized term for the berry of a member of the citrus genus that have these highly partitioned fruits with a rind. A palm is a specialized term for members of the Malloideae subfamily and the rose family, like an apple, that have a fruit formed from an inferior ovary, where the fleshy, tasty part represents the bases of the sepals, stamens, and petals, and the papery core is the ovary. So those are just some examples of fleshy fruits. There's a lot of diversity there. How are we doing? Okay, so I just want to make a few final points about fruit and seed dispersal. As I mentioned, the dispersal mechanisms in flowering plants, super diverse. And here we can see examples in flowering plants where different elements of the fruit were involved in dispersal. Here, an individual seed is the dispersal unit. In this Asian climbing gourd, we have a winged seed that has this expanded seed coat, very much like a glider, that's released into the environment. And a maple, I mentioned earlier, has the entire fruit as the dispersal unit. There's propeller-like movement when it's released. The dandelion I talked about with the parachute-like sepals, the pappus, carrying them away. And here we have, and in this case, it's not just the fruit, but the fruit and the sepals as the dispersal unit. Case of the tumbleweed, members of the genus Salsola in the Chenopodiaceae, we have the entire plant above ground as the dispersal unit. It dries up, breaks free from the base of the plant, and the whole plant blows in the wind, and all the associated fruits on that plant are dispersed. So there are various dispersal units that can occur. These are examples of wind dispersal, abiotic wind dispersal. We also can have dispersal by water. It's especially common in the tropics. We're all familiar with coconuts, which include within the palm family, we have the largest seeds in the world associated with husky fruit with a dry husk surrounding the seed that is buoyant in the entire unit and can persist out in the open ocean for a long time. There's a lot of nutritive tissue inside there for the embryo. And there are also seeds that are released in some water dispersed species that are the buoyant unit of dispersal rather than the fruit. So there's a lot of different abiotic dispersal means, also a lot of dispersal means by animals. So there are some, as I mentioned, there can be dry fruits involved in dispersal by animals, especially if they attach to animals. Sometimes the fruits are sticky or the seeds are sticky and attached, but sometimes the plant is more cruel, like in the puncture vine, and produces these fruits that impale the feet of mammals that carry them around and eventually manage to hopefully get them free and disperse the seeds in that way. Or, as I mentioned, animals can eat the fruits if they're fleshy typically and deposit the seeds in their feces, like in these black bear feces here. These are what we would call passive dispersal means by animals. Whereas there also can be active dispersal, as in the case of seeds that have an elaiosome or a fleshy body attached to them. And we have quite a few examples like this in the California flora, like the bush poppy, that have a fleshy structure that prized by ants, native ants that'll carry the seeds to their nests. And in the process, disperse the seeds. They'll just eat the elaiosome, this fleshy body, and they'll leave the rest of the seed that has the embryo inside of it alone, and it'll be dispersed in that way. And of course, there are a number of animals like jays and squirrels that'll collect seeds or fruits and cache them, like acorns in the case of fruits, cache them away from the parent plant and either forget about some proportion of them or perhaps die before they go back to retrieve them, and the seeds and fruits get dispersed in that way. So those are just other means of, just a few examples of passive and active dispersal by animals. Okay, so that really wraps up what I wanted to say about reproductive morphology, but I'd be happy to take questions now.